probably doesn't come to a surprise to any of you, but I like to eat. And I'll be very honest with you, summer's been kind of rough for me. There's been a handful of times during the summer break, and I say break because it's not really my break, it's my kids' break. There's been several times throughout the day, it's about 11:30 in the morning, and I'm hungry. So I go and I have what I call first lunch. And then an hour or two later, I'll go and I'll have what I call second lunch. And in today's economy, if you think about it, that's probably like one of the worst and irresponsible things to do, to have multiple lunches per day. But unfortunately, that's kind of where it's been for me. Not every single day, just some of the days. But here's my defense to that, however. Most of the time, it's leftovers. So I'm actually helping because eventually, sometimes these leftovers don't get eaten, and then it's wasteful, and we don't want to do that. So I'm actually helping out. I'm going to go with that. I'm going to stick with that. I think that's a good reason for what I'm doing. I'm helping. But at the end of the day, I don't have to worry about missing a meal, as you can plainly see. And it's not, and I'm grateful for that. I mean, it's God's provided for our needs, and we have food to eat and all those things. And I will say to you, though, and I'm going to argue this point this morning, that there are times where it is a very good thing to miss a meal or to miss a day of meals. And it's not always for health reasons. It's not always for that reason. So we're going to talk about that this morning. In our current sermon series, we're obviously talking about these practices of Jesus. And it's been a great sermon series so far. Pastor's done a fantastic job kind of getting us started. First week was on solitude. Last week we talked about prayer. And we see these practices from Jesus himself, and he takes this to his disciples, and we get to experience that even this morning and as we move along. And these are practices that Jesus says that we are to practice. And I think that's one of probably the hardest thing with this topic today is there's not a whole lot of people who practice this discipline of fasting. It's not a practice that we typically take, and I think that's where this challenge comes in. And I'll be honest, when I started studying this topic and looking into this, and I did start a few weeks ago because I knew this trip would be trying on us, and I'm looking online and I'm looking to see if there's resources, and there's this one guy I came across. He was a charismatic teacher. He had dozens of sermons and resources on the topic of prayer, or fasting. And I found it to be very interesting. And because of that, I'm like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm very careful because the approach he took was a little interesting. And we'll kind of see that as we continue this morning. So I want to be kind of careful on how I approach this topic. And I want to make sure that we approach it in a way that's extremely biblical, starting, of course, with the example of Jesus. So let's start there. Where does Jesus practice this himself? And we did see this a couple weeks ago, so this should be a familiar passage for us. But we'll start looking at Matthew chapter 4. We'll get that to you in just a few moments. But when we get into the beginning part of Jesus' ministry, John the Baptist, of course, is sent before him to pave the way and to get Jesus ready, to kind of amp up Jesus. He was kind of like his hype man, right? He was just getting Jesus ready to begin his ministry. And right before Jesus began his ministry, John actually baptized him. And of course, that baptism wasn't because Jesus needed to be baptized, but it was really a foreshadowing of the work that he was about to do in making the gospel, making salvation possible for all people. So we read these words shortly after this baptism in Matthew chapter 4, starting at verse 1. And it says this: "So Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came to him and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread.' But he, Jesus, answered, 'It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God.'" Now, of course, we know, Pat talked about this just a couple weeks ago. This full account takes us into verse 11 and through verse 11. But I really think verse 4, the one that should still be on the board, is really kind of the foundation of this practice of fasting, right? Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of the Lord. That's kind of the basic and fundamental understanding of this idea and understanding of fasting. Because when we fast, and we're going to define this biblically here in just a moment, what it does is it reminds us of our dependence on God, not on food. Not on the physical, but on God. That's what fasting helps us to do. Because what the devil was attempting to do, and notice this was the first thing he tempted Jesus with after Jesus' 40-day and 40-night fast. He was attacking his human nature, that food and that hunger that he was facing at that time when he was the most vulnerable. So what is fasting? That's the first question I want to answer this morning. What is fasting? And we're going to use our main idea this morning to define it. And I came across this definition from a gentleman, Thomas Taraniston, from the C.S. Lewis Institute. And he wrote it this way. He says, fasting is simply going without food in order to seek God for a special reason. Seeking God for a special reason by abstaining from food. So food is the key ingredient, so to speak, in fasting. And I say that because when we looked at solitude, we saw kind of a different kind of spin on this idea and this concept of abstaining and abstinence. Here we see a little bit different aspect because it's specifically relating to food. Both the Hebrew word and the Greek word for fasting is surrounded by the idea of abstaining from food or eating. So that's why biblical fasting, true biblical fasting, is food and abstaining from food. And there seems to be at least two instances where there might have been a slight modification to this within the scriptures. The first one's very obvious, and this actually comes from Daniel. Most of us are familiar with Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and his three buddies, they chose to consume only vegetables and water. Right? Kids in this room were like, no way, bro. No way, man. Right? So only vegetables and water, because what they were doing, ultimately they were convicted by this luxurious food that the king had placed in front of them. And this type of fast would be basically a modified or a partial fast, right? It's not a complete abstinence of food. Another one's an interesting one, and it's not food related, but it's the same idea and word, which is abstain. And that comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5, where Paul actually says that it is permissible for a husband and wife to refrain or abstain from having any type of relations for a period of time so they can focus that on prayer. So a very different understanding, but the same word is used. So those are some modifications that we see within the Bible. And I think it's interesting to point out, too, that there are many, many other reasons and many other religions that practice fasting. Right? As we probably know, Christianity is not, we don't have a hold on fasting, right? It's very, here's some examples. In Islam, or in Judaism, the biblical command comes from Leviticus 23. And it's surrounding the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur as we know it. In Islam, it's one of the 5 pillars of their faith. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it's actually, it's a work. It's considered a work, and what they do is they use it to kind of help them from self-abstinence and spiritual control and cleansing and all those things. And of course, we also know that people fast for health reasons. I know some of the people in this very room who have done that regularly and who have done it somewhat recently as well. Right? People do that for various reasons. Obviously, weight loss and weight control. Obviously, do it for some people do it for inflammation issues. Other people do it for GI issues, which is related. Others do it for blood sugar control. Right? So there's many health reasons and benefits to fasting as well. Others will fast, quote unquote, from social media, TV, things of that nature. And what we've already determined is that's not truly a biblical fast. That really more is aligned with the practice of solitude that we saw just a couple of weeks ago. And what's interesting, too, a very known and well-known example of that would be the practice of Lent that many of our Catholic friends would participate in leading up to Easter. But today, of course, we're focusing on biblical fasting, the abstinence of food. And this isn't to say that these other types of fasting aren't useful and good, right? Again, going back to our sermon just a couple weeks ago from Pat on solitude, we know that those things are good so we can really, again, refocus on our Lord. But not only did Jesus participate and spoke about it, but we also saw that he taught about fasting. And his teaching on fasting is pretty interesting. There's a couple examples. I'll only use one today. And that comes from Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. And here's what Jesus wrote there. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees it in secret will reward you. So that was one of Jesus' teachings on fasting. So the obvious issue there, one of the things that it kind of stood out to me was this word when. And it probably kind of pops out to us as well. And this word when I first saw it, I'm like, oh, this is a command from Jesus. When I first read this passage many years ago, this is a command from Jesus. He's saying, when you do it, so you got to do it, which is true. But what he's not teaching the fact that you have to fast, because this word presupposes that they already are practicing fasting. They are already fasting. People of that day were already making sure that this practice was part of their daily spiritual lives, even those crazy religious people. So not only his disciples were expected to fast, but also the other religious people were doing that, and that's exactly what he's addressing here in this passage. And he does that too with all these other when statements. In the same exact chapter, in chapter 6 of Matthew, he addresses giving and he also addresses prayer. When you pray, when you give. Right? So these are all presuppositions of Jesus that you are already practicing these things as a disciple. What he's doing is he's emphasizing that he not only expects us to do it, but we also are to do it in a manner that's worthy of Jesus. In short, the problem with some of these issues, which of course there are issues, which is why Jesus addressed it, the issues was they were making sure people all knew that they were fasting. Right? They were messing up their hair. They were disheveling their face. They may have missed a button or two. Maybe they forgot to tighten their belt so their pants are sagging a little bit. Right? They're doing this to make sure everybody saw and knew that they were being super holy. And Jesus is like, don't do all that. This is a practice between you and God. This is a practice that you need to take with him. This is to draw you closer to him, not to be seen by others. And that was the issue that Jesus was addressing there. He's not saying, don't fast. He's saying, when you do this, do it in a way that's between you and him and honoring to him. So there's obviously, I think there's a lot of other questions about fasting. And what I didn't want to do this morning when I started writing this sermon is I didn't want to lecture, but there's a lot of information I think is useful for us. And I'm hoping that these will be useful as well. And the question I want to propose to you next is why we should fast. And there are really dozens of answers to this, and we can go through all of them, but I know you don't want to do that. So we're going to discuss 3 specifically, then I'm going to list a handful towards the end of this section. First one here is we should fast to strengthen my prayers. Should fast to strengthen my prayers. This one's really, really important. There's an author I came across in my studies, Donald Miller. He wrote this way. He says, fasting does not change God's hearing, it changes our praying. It doesn't change God's mind or hearing, it changes how we are praying. This is to say that by fasting, we're not opening this secret door, and we're not going down this special path to prayer. Instead, fasting provides a more focused dependence on God. That's what it does. It doesn't open up this special thing where, God's going to answer my prayers now because I fast. And that was the issue I had with this charismatic pastor I talked about earlier that had dozens of sermons because he was saying, hey, you do this, you're opening up this secret spiritual path. That's not what it is. It's to help us develop a focused dependence on God. Here's a great example of this found in Ezra chapter 8. Ezra is getting ready to take the exiles back into Jerusalem, and what he did is he prayed for safe passage. And here's what he wrote in chapter 8, verse 21. He says, then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before God to seek him from a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against our enemy on the way, since we had told the king the hand of our God is for good on all those who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty. They knew that their responsibility and Ezra's responsibility was to take the people into Jerusalem, but they also knew that there was going to be a lot of people who didn't want them to get there, so they prayed and fasted, and God listened to them. So the Christian, we can learn from this that the Christian fasts when there is a strong and spiritual need. When there's a strong spiritual need, that is when a Christian should be fasting. When there is a need that we need his intervention in. And I read this as well, that some have effectively, anytime there's an important decision to make in their lives, that's when they decide that they were going to fast. An important decision to make that's going to impact themselves or their families or whomever, that's when they decide to fast. The next reason we should fast is I should fast to deny myself. And this one might be one of those real fundamental reasons. And this is probably one of those that is extremely important. I'm going to give you an example that doesn't exactly address fasting, but it's the right and correct application. Here's what I see in Galatians chapter 5, verse 16. Paul writes this about the desires of the flesh. He says, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to one another, to keep you from doing the things you want to do." So what we see here is that there's a connection there with the desires of the flesh and fasting. There's a connection in that we can learn. So think about it. What happens when you're at home or you're somewhere where you have easy and quick access to food and you're hungry? What happens? You eat. Right? For me, if I'm working at home in my office and I'm hungry, all I got to do is walk 100 feet to my kitchen or my pantry and I'm good to go. Right? What am I doing? I'm satisfying the desires of my flesh. That's literally what's happening in that moment. I'm satisfying that desire of the flesh. That's the flesh. Fundamentally, when we fast, we're denying the flesh. We're denying that need and that desire that we have. That's what's happening. And of course, it's not for the purpose of torturing ourselves or to annoy the person next to you with the grumblings of the stomach. It's not for that purpose, but it's for the purpose in using that as an opportunity to connect with God. When we fast, if we're not using that to connect with God, we're not fasting, biblically anyway. We're doing it for another purpose. And I've seen this, and I think many times there's a connection of people when they fast. It's during times where they're really struggling with something. Maybe they're struggling with an inherent sin that they've been dealing with for years and years. Maybe they're struggling with addiction or whatever else it might be. That is when a lot of people apply this biblical understanding of fasting, because it's really the same principle. Denying the flesh so you can connect with God. I've recommended that to people. Like when they're dealing with something, like, hey, you've got to start fasting. This is going to help you so much. This is going to draw you so close to God. Because every time you have that urge, you're connecting with God in place of that urge. And that's really the connection there. Look at the scriptures. When you search the scriptures on fasting, it's always connected, almost always, with prayer. It's almost always connected with prayer. Really, what Pat and I could have done when we put this series together, we could have put those two together, and it would have been probably very similar to what we've seen these last couple of weeks. It's the same practice. What you're doing is you're denying all these other thoughts, all these other things, and instead you're refocusing that energy and that commitment to God. And that's really the principle we see both with prayer as well as fasting. So think about this. When your lives start to become very self-centered, when all you're thinking about is yourself and all the things that you are dealing with and all the frustrations that you have and all the stresses that you're facing, that is when you might need to start talking to God about this practice of fasting. That's probably when all those things, because once we start to put our focus on self, we're going to do whatever it takes to satisfy that. And that's not a good place for us to be. I'm going to give you one more reason, then I'll list a few others. I should fast to seek God's guidance. I should fast to seek his guidance. In Acts chapter 13, Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to be sent out for one of their missions. And here's what Luke records in chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. He says, "Now there were in the church in Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, of a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. And when they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." And then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and they sent them off. There's an example here. Did you catch that? I hope you caught that. When they were fasting and praying, that is when the Spirit spoke to them. It wasn't because they were fasting, but their minds were clear. They were focused on God. All their attention was there, and that's when they heard the Spirit speaking. That is when they heard the Spirit speaking. In chapter 14, along the lines of that same story, when Paul and Barnabas, they elected elders, they were also praying and fasting as they did that. So you start to see there's so many reasons the Bible gives us for fasting. All of them are to help us to connect with God. All of them are to help us to refocus on Him. Donald Whitney is the pastor and writer that Pastor Pat mentioned a couple weeks ago, this book on spiritual disciplines. Here's what he wrote about fasting. He says, "Fasting does not ensure the certainty of receiving clear guidance from God, but rightly practiced, however, it does make us more receptive to the one who guides us." It's not a promise that it's going to solve all of our problems, but it's supposed to help us to refocus and to re-energize our focus on Him. And here's where we want to be careful and understand completely. The ones who were changed in the process of fasting is not God, but it's us. He uses this to change our hearts. He uses this to change our focus and our direction. And there's several other reasons. I'm just going to list them real quickly for you. One of them is to, frankly, just to humble yourself before God. Right? Once again, with that idea of being self-centered, when we're no longer self-centered, we're humbling ourselves and realizing our dependence on Him and our need for Him. Another reason would be to prepare for a ministry. Right? Many missionaries will, before they're sent out, before they're gone, they will take a period of time to fast to prepare for that ministry. We saw that with Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14 and the elders there. To express grief, we saw that with the example of David and many times in the scriptures. To seek God's protection, we saw that example in Ezra. And to express our love and worship. It could just be a product of our love and adoration for God. So there's so many other reasons that we haven't discussed yet. So we've already answered a couple questions about fasting, right? We define what it is, which we saw here in our main idea restated here is to going without food in order to seek God for some special reason. Then we also discussed kind of why and reasons that we fast, which I think is very important for us to understand as well. Each, of course, is to draw us closer to God in our prayers and in our overall communion with Him. But I want to talk about a couple more things. First, questions I should ask before I fast. Right? This is important too. What are some things I need to understand or know or ask before I fast? There is something I want to kind of talk through real quickly, and it's a medical disclaimer, and I'm not a medical professional by any means, but there are probably some of you in this room that probably shouldn't do a full fast. Let's just be honest. It's probably not a medically important thing that you do. However, there are other ways to fast, and we'll talk about that as well. But talk to your doctors if you really feel like you're moved to do something and to fast. If you haven't done that already, then make sure that you're doing it in the right way. But first question to ask is very important. Why? Why are you fasting? This is the first question that you need to ask. Why am I fasting? This almost seems obvious. And here's one theory, because you're so moved by this sermon that you're going to go home and fast today. Very unlikely. Very unlikely, right? I know that I'm not so moving that you're going to do that, but there has to be a reason. I'll give you my reason for the first time I fasted. I was in a rough week. I was having tempted thoughts. I was depressed a little bit. I was discouraged. I was not happy with who I was. And I happened to be reading a book on prayer, two pastors from E.M. Bounds. And there was a section in there that talked a little bit about prayer and fasting kind of together. And it hit me as I'm doing my reading that, you know what, this is something that I need to do. I was compelled and convicted that I needed to spend some time fasting. So I skipped breakfast and lunch. Started pretty small. We'll talk about that later too. So I fasted. Every time I had that hunger pain, every time I had an urge, every time I wanted to get up and eat or do something else, I focused my attention on God and I prayed. Or I read my Bible. It was an incredible, rewarding experience. Because I was able to refocus on Him, and that kind of changed my heart attitude and it changed my mindset to allow me to do that. For me, my reason, my why, was because I needed to refocus on God instead of myself. So each of us, when we fast, we need a reason to do so. Here are some biblical examples of that. I mentioned a couple of them already. David fasted when his child was dying. Do you remember that? His child was dying. It was prophesied he was going to die. And during that time, he fasted and prayed, and he fasted and prayed. Jonah chapter 3, the people of Nineveh, they believed the warning from Jonah that they were going to be destroyed as a people, and they actually fasted during that time, and they prayed for God to deliver them from destruction. Those are just a couple of examples. We have to have a clear reason for fasting. Another question to ask before fasting is, what kind of fast will I do? What kind of fast? This is to say, am I going to abstain from all food? Am I going to maybe do a partial fast, an intermittent fast? Maybe it's going to be a liquid-only fast. There's so many types of fasting out there. You have to determine which one. But go back to that first question of why. Why am I doing this? That has to determine how and what you're doing and the reason for that. They should go hand in hand. What's the purpose of this fast and what makes the most sense in respects to that? Many of you maybe heard of the Daniel fast. We talked about Daniel a little bit earlier, but back in 2007, they did a whole movement on the Daniel fast. And books were written, videos were made, the whole 9 yards. And of course, it was a 21-day fast. And in this writing, the idea was to help them during the fast was to pray and to meditate and to reflect for this period of time. And of course, it was a vegetable and water-only diet. Again, kids are crossing off Daniel fast off their to-do list. No, thank you. Right? The kind of fast you do, think about it, the kind of fast you do is not as important as why you are fasting. That's kind of the point here. The type of fast you do is not as important because your desire should be on glorifying God and to drawing closer to Him during that time. So how you fast or what kind of fast you do is really not that important. But there are many directions you could go. And then the last question to consider and ask, or at least one other question to consider and ask, is how long should I fast? How long should I fast? But again, go back to that first question, why? Why am I fasting? And I'll give you an example of that. Maybe you're facing a very important decision in your life, something that's going to impact you and your family. Maybe you have to make a decision on that in 7 days. What do you think would be an appropriate time to fast if that's the case? 7 days, right? And of course, 7 days without food is difficult. So maybe that determines the type of fast you do, right? So it really, I think they're all intertwined, and it's very dependent on the purpose of fasting. I read an article of a man who was fasting and praying over his child who was dealing with cancer and cancer treatment. And while he was in treatment is when this father decided he was going to fast. So while the child was going through this treatment for this horrible disease, that is when the father decided that was the time for him to do so. And that's an appropriate treatment and an appropriate reason. But here's the issue too. If we go to the scriptures, there's not a specific prescribed reason and way to do this. Right? The example we just used from Jesus when we opened up was 40 days. That's a long time. The example we saw from David was 7 days. The example we saw from Daniel was 21 days. Moses twice fasted for 40 days when he was up in the mountain getting the word from God. That one, of course, is a supernatural fast. There's no way any of us humanly can survive a 40-day fast. How long may be determined on the purpose of your fast. And there's obviously other reasons to consider, your health being one of them. Talk to a medical professional about what your body is able to do. I read somewhere that you can only go without water for like 3 days, right? So if you're going to go 3 to 5 days without food or water, talk to somebody. Talk to somebody. So we talk about this often, though, right? There has to be the proper motivation in why we fast and when we fast or when we do anything as Christians, right? It's all about that heart attitude. How are we approaching this with our heart? Anything we do must be driven by a heart change. Everything we do must be driven by the change of heart because of the saving work of Jesus and what he did for us. That's the motivation for anything that we are doing. And I mentioned this earlier, but when we are not doing this with the purpose of edifying or really lifting Jesus up and glorifying God, if we're not doing it for those reasons and we're not doing it because of a changed heart, dare I say, all these things we're doing is worthless. All we're doing is doing. So finally, I'm going to close with this. Some instruction on how to fast. 3 simple, short things. First one is to pray. You got to pray about it. If you're thinking about this and you're being moved in some capacity for this, you got to make sure you take it to him first. Don't just go home and start doing it. Pray about it. God, lead me, direct me, show me, teach me. We got to make sure we're praying about it. So here's some questions to consider as you think about this. Are you stuck in a continuous prayer that doesn't seem to be moving? Are you feeling disconnected from God or other Christians? Are you needing God's guidance on a big decision or direction in your lives? Are you grieving about something? Are you struggling on how to personally connect and worship with God? Are you struggling with sin? If you answered yes to any of those questions or similar type questions, then God might be moving you to fast. He might be moving you to fast and to draw closer to him in those moments. And then the next thing I want to encourage you in how to fast is to start small. This is interesting too, because I wrote this around the same time that Pat was putting together his first sermon. Before I saw his, and he used the same exact one when we talked about solitude. It's consistency. That's a good thing. Right? We got to start small. Again, if you're going to go on to, just do the Daniel fast for your very first ever fast, it might not be a great way to do it. If you're going to, go 7 days without food, probably not the best thing to do. Start small. Skip a meal. That's okay. The idea, again, is not the type, but it's why. It's using that time to connect. If you want to do a week-long fast, maybe do 1 week or 1 meal at a time. Right? 1 day per day of the week. Right? That's not a bad way to start. Experts say that you need to make sure that while you're fasting that you stay hydrated. Right? Or some of our youth groupers will say hydrate or dihydrate. Right? You got to hydrate. That's one of the things that's most important. Now, others will warn that you might feel kind of sick and groggy and cranky, or as a lot of us like to say, hangry. Right? But again, when those things happen, what is our bodies trying to tell us, and what is the Spirit trying to tell us? Pray. Seek him. Right? Anytime we have those kind of reactions in the body, that is when we have to seek God. And then finally here is we need to end well. So we need to pray about it, we need to start small, and we need to end well. And what do I mean by that? Many people make the horrible mistake of trying to catch up at the end of their fast. I'm just going to stuff my face, eat 5 meals in one setting. Guess what? Your body just went through something very traumatic, and it's going to take time for your body to react to that. So when you come out of your fast, don't go grabbing some In-N-Out burger and fries and putting all that lovely grease into your body. Right? You start small. Maybe it's a fruit or a veggie or a fruit juice or something just to kind of get your body back into that practice. If you have a prayer journal, I think this is a great time to use that as you're going through your fast. Write down what God's teaching you in those moments. Write down what God is revealing to you and instructing you in those days. And then I tell you what, go back to those things and read it and reflect on it And God's going to help and continue to speak to you in those moments. So this morning we've talked a lot about, we learned about the practice of fasting, the definition of fasting. We answered some questions about fasting. I even helped you to see some ways that we can and how to start and how to finish. The scriptures, of course, have many examples of this. Countless examples that we didn't have even any time to really scratch the surface. But Jesus' example is very clear. He says Christians are to fast. He says that Christians are to fast. All these practices we're talking about in this series are commands and instructions from Jesus. So it's very important that we understand that. There's an expectation to fast, and that does include you, and that includes myself. So my question to you as we close is this: are you ready to take this next step in your spiritual journey with God? Let's pray. Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for your word that reveals so much to us. Thank you, God, for these disciplines, these practices of Jesus that help us to draw closer to you. And what I love about these is what they do is not about us, but it's about changing our hearts to reflect what you desire from us. I pray, God, that if nobody in this room has fasted before, that they prayerfully consider these things. It is not an easy thing to do. It's almost intimidating and scary. So God, I ask that you give us courage. I ask that you give us the desire to please you in this way. Help us to draw closer to you in incorporating this practice in our lives. I pray, Father, that you speak to each and every one of us and help us at a minimum just to understand how to connect with you more. There's so many ways that you're revealing to us in this series that help us to do that. And I pray, God, that each and every one of us leave this room and leave this auditorium, and that we increase these practices within our lives. Because the goal of every Christian in this room is to be, hopefully, to be more and more like Jesus every day. And these are going to help us to do that. And we want to glorify you in it, Father. And if you decide to give and provide for us in these times, that's an extra benefit for us. We want to be more and more like Jesus. So help us to do that by incorporating these practices. We can be transformed. That is our hope and desire in this sermon series, Father. And I pray, God, that you speak to us as we continue through this. And I pray for each and every person in this room today that might be going through something. And I pray, God, that you move them in a very, very special way. I ask that in Jesus' holy name. Amen.